Conscription, or the draft as it's more commonly known, has been around for thousands of years. The practice has transcended all time, societal, and cultural boundaries as a common method of raising manpower for military service when volunteers were not enough to fill out the ranks. After all, the prospect of harsh conditions, disease, and death in battle is not a great incentive to most people. This was especially so for wars before the 21st century, where advances in technology and sanitary conditions for troops in the battlefield were nowhere near the quality they are today. The draft itself has its roots all the way back in the Code of Hammurabi, which was the first written legal code in the world hailing from ancient Mesopotamia. Here, men were obligated to perform yearly military service at the discretion of their rulers for most of their lives. The practice continued on through the Middle Ages, where landed serfs, as a requirement for owning property, were forced to provide at least one son to feudal armies. Despite these earlier conscription examples, the idea of avoiding the draft and the controversy surrounding it was not subject for public debate until the Napoleonic Wars. Called the Levial Mass, this was the first general draft in modern history. All French citizens were required to register, and it was this general draft that created the baseline for drafts to come. All citizens were required to register by birth year, and they would be called up once they reached the age of 21. Wealthier French citizens could afford to purchase an exemption and thereby avoid military service. The idea of exempting oneself to military service by paying the government a rather large sum of money infuriated most people who saw the conflict as a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. The sentiment was one of the main reasons for early draft dodgers throughout the 19th century. During this time, there was not a whole lot one could do to avoid the draft if one was called up. There was no robust medical system like there is in today's military, where pre-existing conditions could get you exempted from service. Nor was there what's called a conscientious objector status for those opposed to war on moral or religious grounds. It was difficult to avoid the draft in the 19th century America merely by running away, since most people around this time were small yeoman farmers. Leaving their families and property behind without a penny to their name and going to another country was an unlikely scenario. Rather, most of those opposed to the draft would rather desert from the military after being forced into it. Doing so had a few obvious benefits. They could procure arms for themselves for personal defense, have a few extra dollars in their pocket, and most importantly, avoid the shame of being considered a draft dodger. After joining, whether it was a Union or Confederate army, they could reasonably justify their desertion to others by stating that the government had not upheld its bargain of the contractual obligation of their enlistment. Though desertion would forfeit a pension, the stigma from avoiding the draft could be avoided, which was of greater immediate concern to those forced to join the army. The vast majority of the Confederate Army and a large portion of the Union Army were all drafted into the service, so there were plenty of people who did not want to be there. Those who deserted from both sides could face a possible death sentence if apprehended again. Though thousands of deserters were caught and death sentences issued, very few were carried out. Several hundred Union soldiers and probably a similar number of Confederate ones were shot for this crime. It is important to mention that the vast majority of those executed for desertion were notorious bounty jumpers. It was common in the North to offer enlistment bonuses called bounties of up to $300, which was a tremendous sum at the time. It was rather common for some of these professional bounty jumpers to simply enlist, desert, and then enlist again in another unit. While not draft dodging per se, it was a way for criminally minded people to avoid active service and make a handsome profit at the same time. It was these men that were most often executed for this crime, but not all. There was a famous case coming from Stonewall Jackson's army where a private left the army to care for his ailing mother. He claimed that he did not want to continue serving for this reason alone. After being apprehended, Stonewall Jackson did not believe him and had the private executed anyway. Not all draft resistors took a passive stance, however. A Confederate private by the name of Newt Knight became disillusioned with the war. He was one of the many Confederates who had remained a staunch Unionist and was morally opposed to slavery. After serving for over a year in the Army, he deserted and went back home to his farm in Jones County, Mississippi. Here, he formed an independent company of armed deserters, runaway slaves, and those who refused to fight for the Confederacy into a guerrilla movement. Knight's group of guerrillas attacked and harassed many of the dreaded tax collectors who were robbing Southern homes of all their food and livestock. He even skirmished with regular Confederate troops over a dozen times. Confederate authorities were powerless to force the draft dodgers to subdue and sent in massive reinforcements to crush the rebellion. The Confederate Army managed to capture and execute 10 of Knight's men, but the majority of the band slipped away into the wilderness. They were able to outlast the Confederates until the end of the war. The area where Newt and his men operated henceforth became known in the history books as the Free State of Jones. While armed resistance and being forced to fight was certainly rare, resistance to being drafted to fight for a cause one did not believe in continued on for years to come. Some of the most notable examples of this come from the First World War. In Great Britain, the issue of the draft was highly contentious, and many, after seeing the great suffering on a massive scale, were not interested in fighting a politically motivated war. This staunch group of pacifists and religious objectors solidified the theory of conscientious objection. Conscientious objection is the opposition to war on moral or religious grounds that serving in the military would violate one's personal beliefs. In Britain, the military authorities for the first time in history recognized this as a valid exemption to service and began hearing cases of those who wanted to apply for such status. However, being awarded it was incredibly difficult, and of the tens of thousands of cases heard, only a select handful were awarded this coveted status. For the rest of those who claimed conscientious objector status but were turned down, an alternative method of service was offered. This was known as the Non-Combatant Core, also known as the No Courage Corps by a deriding public. That would allow these men to serve in auxiliary roles in supply and in hospitals for the army. But one group of men, known as the Richmond 16, refused to do even this service. The Richmond 16 were actually a group of 44 men from different NCC barracks around Great Britain who refused to do service. The Richmond 16 were just the first ones to be imprisoned for their insubordination. After trying to convince them to work for the army and their continued refusal, the army gave them two choices: work or die. The British Army did face a dilemma here in that they could not sentence the men to death in Great Britain since the crime of insubordination was not punishable by death. Therefore, the army came up with a plan to send all 44 men to an area near the front in France where they could come under enemy fire. If they refused to wear a uniform and work here, they could be charged with cowardice before the enemy, which would earn them a death sentence. The Richmond 16 were staunch in their beliefs, and so they were sent to France. They refused even their last opportunity to cave in, despite authorities attempting to lie, stating others had already gave in to service. Within the next week, all 42 men were sentenced to be shot, but swift action from the Prime Minister saved their lives. Instead, the Richmond 16 were all given 10-year prison terms, but released in 1919. Great Britain was not alone in its ill treatment of those who did not want to serve. Even tiny New Zealand wanted every available man to fight at the front. As part of the Commonwealth, New Zealand was committed entirely to World War I, and beginning in 1915 instituted a draft of all available men for military service. Archibald Baxter was one of about 100 conscientious objectors who did not want to serve. All 100 of these men were imprisoned instead. By the summer of 1917, with the end of the war nowhere in sight and casualties mounting, it was decided that even these men would be sent to the front. Against their wishes, Baxter and 13 others were forced into troopship, locked into solitary confinement, and sent to France. Along the way, their guards humiliated them and stripped them of their clothes for refusing to wear uniforms. They were often beaten and had ice-cold water thrown on them. After arriving in France, the men were continually subjected to torture, beatings, and being forced to hold heavy weights over their heads for long periods of time paled in comparison to their worst punishment: Field Punishment Number 1. Field Punishment Number 1 entailed tying Baxter and others to a pole within the camp for hours at a time. No matter if it was raining or snowing, they would be tied to it out in the open. Their camp was well within range of German artillery, and even with shell fire coming in, they would not be taken down. After months of this torture, only Baxter and one other man held out against serving. It was then that the New Zealand authorities decided to literally tie wire around the men and drag them to the front. Baxter reports that Mark Briggs, his only remaining compatriot, was forced headfirst into a shell crater, and then a sadistic sergeant forced a handful of mud into his mouth to increase his suffering. Despite all the abuse the two men endured, they never wavered in their beliefs. Baxter went home in April of 1918, while Briggs did not go back until 1919. Upon arrival, Baxter was seen as a national hero by many for never wavering in his beliefs, and has become an icon for pacifism in New Zealand and around the world. The cruel punishments meted out to those who refused to serve in a nation's draft continued well past the First World War. During the Second War, numerous countries executed those who did not want to participate in the conflict. Some of the most famous cases came out of Nazi Germany, where men like Franz Jägerstätter, who along with dozens of other pacifists were beheaded by the Nazis for refusing to fight for them. Even after World War II and up until the present day, numerous countries enacted laws that made avoiding the draft a felony offense. During the Vietnam War, tens of thousands of young American men were prosecuted and over 4,000 imprisoned for refusing to fight. In Eastern Europe during the Cold War, the vast majority of other countries' militaries were filled with draftees, and their governments often sentenced those who refused to serve to lengthy prison terms. Even up to this day, draft dodgers face discrimination and criminal prosecution in most countries that have mandatory military service. In Russia, for example, those who do not serve cannot work in public sector jobs for 10 years. In Colombia, those who do not serve or have the money to pay for a veteran ID card on the black market face limited job prospects without one. Countries like North Korea are said to routinely execute anyone who does not want to join the military, and even those who have valid exemptions for medical reasons are still considered second-class citizens. Avoiding the draft has only been a real option for the past several hundred years. During this time, people have avoided it for a variety of reasons, but the most common one is for deep-seated religious beliefs. Governments around the world have reluctantly accepted this line of reasoning and begrudgingly let limited numbers avoid service for this reason. But for most people, simply refusing to fight is the only way to guarantee their personal survival. In these cases, history has shown time and again that governments will go to extreme measures to force people to serve when they do not want to, in order to set an example for others. How effective these measures have been at preventing further dissent is a matter of debate. But what is certain is that those who do not want to fight for a cause they do not believe in face social stigma, limited job prospects, and stiff punishments.